A heavy deadbolt sliding into place makes a very specific sound. It is a metallic thud that echoes off glass walls and kills the oxygen in a room. Nora knew that sound. She also knew the man standing between her and the only exit. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He just stared at the massive bouquet of white orchids sitting on her desk, his jaw ticking, before asking a question that sounded more like a death sentence. "Who bought you those?" Nora Hayes did not believe in romance. She believed in spreadsheets, bills of lading, and the absolute unyielding certainty of mathematics. Working on the 42nd floor of a Chicago high-rise for Rossi Imports required a healthy dose of pragmatism. Officially, she managed international shipping routes for high-end European textiles. Unofficially, she made sure customs and border protection looked the other way when certain unmarked crates arrived at the docks. It was a dangerous job, but Nora liked danger when it was confined to columns and rows. It was predictable. If you made a mistake, someone went to prison. If you did your job well, a heavy envelope of cash appeared in your bottom desk drawer on the first of the month. Clean, simple, transactional. Human emotion, on the other hand, was messy. It left a trail. At exactly 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, the mess arrived. The delivery boy looked terrified stepping off the private elevator. He was clutching a massive, sprawling arrangement of white orchids in a heavy crystal vase. He navigated the bullpen of silent, broad-shouldered men in tailored suits, swallowing hard as every eye in the room tracked his movement. When he reached Nora's glass-walled office, he practically shoved the vase onto her desk. "Sign here," he muttered, thrusting a digital pad at her. Nora stared at the flowers. They were obnoxiously large, taking up a third of her mahogany desk, their long, pale stems curving elegantly under the harsh fluorescent lights. They smelled like expensive perfume and bad decisions. "I didn't order these," Nora said, her voice dry. She didn't reach for the pen. "They're paid for, lady. Please, just sign." The kid looked over his shoulder. Two of Rossi's men who technically held titles like logistics coordinator, but possessed knuckles coated in scar tissue, were staring unblinking at the kid. Nora sighed, scribbled her initials on the screen, and dismissed him. The moment the kid retreated onto the elevator, the bullpen went back to work. Keyboards clattered. Phones rang. But the tension in the air had shifted. In the Rossi organization, nothing arrived on the 42nd floor without clearance. Someone sending an extravagant gift directly to Nora's desk was not just a romantic gesture. It was a breach of security. It was a statement. Nora pulled the small, heavy cardstock envelope from the center of the arrangement. She broke the wax seal with her thumb. "To a beautiful woman who deserves more than a desk job. Dinner tonight. Arthur Davies." Arthur Davies, the new client from London. He owned a fleet of cargo ships and had spent the last 3 weeks trying to negotiate a lower tariff with Rossi's operation. He had also spent the last 3 weeks staring at Nora's legs during board meetings. He was wealthy, arrogant, and entirely ignorant of the reality of the people he was doing business with. He thought Rossi Imports was just a tough corporate firm. He didn't know the CEO was currently under investigation for 2 separate indictments involving extortion. Nora tossed the card onto her desk. She should throw the flowers away. It was the smart thing to do. If she dragged the heavy crystal vase to the break room trash can, it would be over. but a small, cynical part of her hesitated. She had been working 70-hour weeks for 3 years. She had sacrificed her social life, her sleep, and her peace of mind to keep Vincent Rossi's shipping lines running perfectly. She had never received a single word of thanks. Just cash, just nods. Let the flowers sit, she thought. They look nice. She went back to typing. 2 hours later, the temperature in the office seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Nora didn't have to look up from her monitor to know he had arrived. The low hum of chatter in the bullpen died instantly. Phones were muted. Chairs stopped squeaking. It was a quiet, born out of absolute institutional fear. Vincent Rossi walked through the glass double doors of the 42nd floor. He didn't swagger. He didn't strut. He moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who owned the concrete beneath his feet. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Nora's first car, the jacket unbuttoned, revealing a crisp white shirt without a tie. His dark hair was meticulously neat, but there were faint shadows under his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked dangerous. Nora kept her eyes on her spreadsheet. She could track his progress through the bullpen just by the shifting shadows and the subtle exhales of the men he passed. Usually, Vincent went straight to his corner office, a sprawling corner suite at the far end of the hall. He would shut the heavy oak door, and Nora wouldn't see him until he needed a route cleared or a manifest altered. Today, his footsteps stopped. Nora's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She looked up. Vincent was standing on the other side of her glass wall. He wasn't looking at her. His dark, impenetrable eyes were fixed entirely on the sprawling arrangement of white orchids on her desk. He stood there for a long 5 seconds. The silence in the bullpen stretched so thin it threatened to snap. Then he reached out, pushed the glass door of her office open, and stepped inside. He didn't say a word as he crossed the threshold. Vincent reached backward without looking and pushed the glass door shut. His hand found the metal deadbolt. With a slow, deliberate twist of his wrist, he locked it. The heavy thud echoed in the small room. Nora's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs, but she forced her face to remain completely neutral. She leaned back in her ergonomic mesh chair, folding her hands in her lap. Cowering was the worst thing you could do around a man like Vincent. It was like bleeding in shark-infested water. You survived him by holding your ground. Vincent tapped the control panel on the wall. The clear glass walls of her office instantly turned a frosted, opaque white, cutting them off from the view of the bullpen. They were entirely alone. He turned to face her. The sheer size of him in the enclosed space made the air feel thin. He smelled of ozone, cold coffee, and a distinct, sharp cologne that Nora always associated with bad news. He didn't look at her face. He walked slowly around the edge of her mahogany desk, his gaze remaining violently fixed on the white flowers. "I was running the projections for the Atlantic routes," Nora said, her voice steady, refusing to let the silence win. "The new tariffs are going to cut our margins by 4%. Vincent stopped beside her desk. He was so close she could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his throat. He reached out with one large, heavily scarred hand and brushed the delicate petal of a white orchid. His touch was alarmingly gentle, a stark contrast to the coiled tension radiating from his body. "Who bought you those?" he asked. His voice was a low, rough baritone. It wasn't a shout. It barely registered above a whisper. But it carried the weight of a loaded gun. "A client," Nora said evenly. A client. Vincent repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. He turned his head slowly, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was dark, suffocating, and entirely unreadable. Which client, Nora? Arthur Davies, she said. She held his stare. It's a standard corporate thank you gift. I helped his team navigate the customs block in New Jersey last week. On a standard corporate gift. Vincent's hand moved from the petal to the thick crystal rim of the vase. His knuckles were white. Standard corporate gifts are fruit baskets. They are pens with company logos. They are not 3 dozen white orchids imported from South America. Nora felt a prickle of irritation push through her caution. He has money to burn. It's a tax write-off for him. Don't look too deeply into it. I look deeply into everything that happens in my building, Vincent said softly. He picked up the heavy cardstock envelope from the desk. He didn't ask for permission. He opened it, his dark eyes scanning Arthur's handwritten words. Nora watched a muscle feather in his jaw. She watched the way his chest expanded with a slow, controlled intake of breath. He was furious. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger he used when a shipment was seized. It was something else, something erratic. Dinner tonight, Vincent read aloud, his voice devoid of inflection. He dropped the card back onto the desk. Are you going? No, Nora said. Why not? He thinks you deserve more than a desk job. The mockery in his tone was razor thin. Because I have to finalize the quarterly reports, and Arthur Davies is an idiot who doesn't understand maritime law, Nora replied smoothly. Also, I don't mix business with my personal life. Your personal life. Vincent took a step closer to her chair. He was invading her space now, intentionally crowding her. You don't have a personal life, Nora. You work for me. The audacity of the statement made her bristle. She pushed her chair back a few inches, though it did little to create distance. I am your logistics director, Mr. Rossi. I am not your property. I work 40 to 70 hours a week for this firm. What I do with the remaining hours, or who sends me flowers, is not your concern. It was a dangerous thing to say. She knew it the moment the words left her mouth. Vincent went perfectly still. The silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the line of her throat, the set of her jaw, the defiant glare in her eyes. Not my concern, he echoed softly. Suddenly his hand lashed out. He didn't hit her, he hit the vase. With a sweeping, violent motion, he shoved the massive crystal vase off the desk. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. Water exploded across the floorboards. Shards of thick glass scattered like shrapnel. The pristine white orchids were instantly bruised, crushed beneath the weight of the shattered crystal, lying in a spreading puddle of water. Nora flinched, gripping the armrests of her chair, but she didn't scream. She stared at the wreckage on her floor, her chest heaving. Vincent stood over it, his chest rising and falling, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Clean it up," he said, his voice ragged. "Are you out of your mind?" Nora snapped, her anger finally breaking through her professional facade. She stood up, kicking a piece of glass away with her heel. "You can't just come in here and destroy things because you're throwing a tantrum." Vincent moved so fast she didn't have time to step back. He closed the distance between them, his hands slamming down onto the edge of her desk, caging her in. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The smell of his cologne wrapped around her, intoxicating and sharp. "Do you know who Arthur Davies is?" Vincent demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. "Do you know what he does to women who go to dinner with him?" "I told you I wasn't going," Nora shot back, refusing to lean away. "He doesn't get to look at you," Vincent said, the words slipping out with a feral, unrestrained intensity. "He doesn't get to send things to my building. He doesn't get to put his name on a piece of paper and leave it on your desk." Nora's breath caught in her throat. She stared into his dark eyes, realizing for the first time that this wasn't about security. This wasn't about the cartel. "Vincent," she started, using his first name for the first time in 3 years. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenching, as if the sound of his name on her lips caused him physical pain. When he opened them, the cold, calculating Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man unraveling. "I pay you to keep my life in order," Vincent whispered, his voice dropping an octave. He lifted one hand from the desk. His knuckles were bleeding slightly from where a piece of glass had clipped him, but he didn't seem to notice. He hovered his hand near her cheek, not quite touching her, the heat of his skin radiating against hers. "I pay you to handle the logistics, to make things make sense. But this," he gestured sharply toward the ruined flowers on the floor, "this doesn't make sense." Nora stood frozen. She could feel the erratic beat of her own heart echoing in her ears. She was a cynical woman. She knew how men operated. They wanted to possess things. They wanted to mark their territory. But the look in Vincent's eyes wasn't just territorial. It was desperate. "They were just flowers," she managed to say, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Nothing in my world is just anything," Vincent replied. His hand finally closed the distance. His thumb brushed lightly against her jawline. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of shock straight down her spine. His skin was rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. "You're crossing a line," Nora warned, though she didn't pull away. "I crossed the line the day I hired you," Vincent muttered, his gaze dropping to her lips before dragging back up to her eyes. "I sat in that interview room 3 years ago, watching you tear apart my shipping manifests, and I knew I was going to have a problem. I am an asset to this company. You are a liability to my sanity," he corrected softly. He took a step closer, forcing Nora to lean back against the edge of her desk. The hard wood pressed into her lower back. There was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The glass was frosted. They were in a white, soundproof box, surrounded by shattered crystal and crushed flowers. "I watch you," Vincent confessed, the admission torn from him. He stepped fully into her space, his chest brushing against hers. "Every day, I sit in that office and I watch you drink terrible break room coffee. I watch you argue with the foreman on the phone. I watch you stay until 8 at night because you refuse to leave a job unfinished." "That's my job," she whispered, her throat dry. "It's an obsession," he corrected. His thumb stroked her cheek again, tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Mine, not yours." Nora's mind raced. This was the man who had ordered hits on rival syndicates. This was the man the FBI had a task force dedicated to destroying. He was violent, ruthless, and entirely devoid of morality when it came to his business. And yet, right now, his hand was trembling slightly against her skin. "You can't do this," Nora said, trying to hold on to her pragmatic worldview. "We work together. You're you." "I know exactly who I am," Vincent said, his eyes darkening. "I am a man who takes what he wants. and I have spent 3 years not taking you. Do you have any idea what that has cost me?" Nora swallowed hard. "Arthur Davies. If you ever say his name again, I will have his fleet sunk at the docks," Vincent interrupted, his tone chillingly casual. "I will bankrupt him by Friday. I will ensure he never steps foot on American soil again." "You're being irrational." "I am entirely irrational right now," Vincent agreed, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. He let out a long, ragged exhale, closing his eyes. "I saw those flowers, Nora. I saw them on your desk, and I wanted to burn the building down." Nora squeezed her eyes shut. She should push him away. She should remind him of sexual harassment laws, of corporate policy, of the fact that getting involved with a cartel boss was the fastest way to end up in a shallow grave. But she didn't. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his presence, and a terrifying realization settled in her gut. She liked it. She liked that he had shattered the vase. She liked the possessive, feral undertone in his voice. Her cynical, logical brain was screaming at her to run, but her body remained rooted to the spot, leaning into his warmth. "So," Nora whispered, opening her eyes to look at him. "What happens now?" Vincent pulled back just enough to look at her face. The exhaustion in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a sharp, burning intensity. He dropped his hand from her cheek and gripped her waist, hauling her flush against him. "Now," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I buy you flowers, and if anyone else ever tries, I put them in the ground." Vincent did not kiss her. A lesser man would have. A man driven purely by impulse would have crashed his mouth against hers, letting the adrenaline of the moment dictate the outcome. But Vincent was an architect of control. He held her there against the edge of the mahogany desk, his grip on her waist bruising, his breath hot against her temple. He let her feel the absolute certainty of his restraint. It was a promise, heavy and suffocating. Then he let her go. The absence of his heat felt like a physical blow. Nora gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. Vincent stepped back. The feral, unraveling man from 10 seconds ago was gone, packed away behind a wall of cold, unreadable obsidian. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. He didn't look at the ruined orchids on the floor. He didn't look at her face. He walked to the door, pressed the control panel, and the frosted glass instantly bled back to a clear, unforgiving transparency. He flipped the deadbolt. The heavy metallic clack echoed in the quiet office. Without a backward glance, Vincent opened the door and walked out. Nora remained frozen against her desk. Through the clear glass, she watched him cross the bullpen. The silence he left in his wake was entirely different from the silence of his arrival. When he walked in, the men had been terrified. Now, as he walked back to his corner suite, the men were absolutely paralyzed. Every single head in the bullpen was angled slightly down, but their eyes flicked toward Nora's office. They had all seen Vincent Rossi enter. They had all heard the lock engage. They had all seen the glass frost over. And now they could all see the shattered crystal and the ruined white flowers bleeding water into the hardwood floor. Nora swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She forced her hands to unclench. She was a logistics director. She solved problems. Right now, the problem was a mess on her floor. She bypassed the intercom button that would summon the janitorial staff. Inviting someone else into this room felt like a violation of a crime scene. Instead, Nora walked over to the supply closet in the corner of her office, retrieved a heavy canvas trash bag and a roll of paper towels, and knelt on the damp floor. The water had soaked into the expensive cardstock of Arthur Davies's note, turning the ink into a meaningless blue smudge. Nora picked it up between two fingers and dropped it into the bag. She gathered the thick, bruised stems of the orchids. The petals were crushed, browning at the edges where the heavy crystal had severed them. They felt slimy and tragic in her hands. She shoved them into the canvas bag. Then came the glass. She picked up the jagged shards one by one. Her mind, usually a fortress of numbers and schedules, was dangerously quiet. She tried to run the Atlantic route projections in her head, but all she could feel was the phantom pressure of Vincent's thumb tracing her jawline. "You are a liability to my sanity." A sharp sting dragged her back to reality. Nora hissed, dropping a piece of crystal. A thin, bright line of red welled up on the pad of her index finger. She had gripped a shard too tightly. She stared at the blood. It was a small, stupid injury, but it broke the dam. Nora sat back on her heels in the middle of her office, surrounded by wet paper towels and broken glass, and let out a shaky, jagged breath. She pressed her thumb hard against the cut, watching the blood smear. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, and she had just realized she wanted to jump. 3 years she had spent keeping her head down. She had justified the work by treating it as an abstract mathematical equation. Rossi Imports moved boxes. She organized the boxes. The contents of those boxes, the blood spilled over those routes, the men who vanished when a shipment went missing. She kept all of that carefully compartmentalized in a locked box in her mind. Vincent had just taken a crowbar to that box. He was not just her boss anymore. He was a predator who had just circled her, marked her, and walked away, expecting her to wait for his return. Nora wrapped a paper towel tightly around her bleeding finger. She finished throwing away the glass, tied the canvas bag shut, and shoved it into the corner. She sat back down in her ergonomic mesh chair. She unlocked her computer screen. The spreadsheet for the Atlantic route stared back at her, cold and logical. She placed her hands on the keyboard and began to type. She didn't leave at 6. She didn't leave at 7. At 8:30, the bullpen was entirely empty, plunged into darkness save for the emergency exit lights and the harsh glow of Nora's office. At 8:40, her desk phone rang. It was an internal line. The caller ID read, V. Rossi. Nora stared at the blinking red light. It flashed 5 times. 6. On the 7th ring, she picked up the receiver. "Yes?" she answered, her voice deliberately flat. "Go home, Nora." Vincent's voice scraped through the speaker, low and exhausted. "The routes will be there tomorrow." "I have 3 more manifests to clear for the Rotterdam dock," she lied. A heavy silence stretched over the line. She could hear the faint sound of ice clinking against glass. He was drinking. "Go home," he repeated softly, "before I come down there and make you." The threat wasn't professional. It was entirely personal. It sent a hot, dangerous thrill straight down her spine. Nora hung up the phone without another word. She saved her work, shut down her computer, and grabbed her coat. Friday night in Chicago smelled like freezing rain, diesel exhaust, and raw iron. Terminal 4 was a massive, sprawling concrete scar on the edge of the water. High-pressure sodium lights cast a sickly, orange-yellow glare over thousands of stacked shipping containers. The wind whipped off the lake, carrying a biting cold that cut straight through the wool of Nora's tailored coat. She stood at the base of a towering crane, a glowing tablet in her hands, flanked by two of Rossi's men. They were thick-necked, silent enforcers who kept their hands buried deep in the pockets of their heavy jackets, resting on the grips of concealed weapons. Nora hated the docks. She preferred the clean, sanitized view of the supply chain from the 42nd floor. But tonight required her physical presence. A customs inspector had flagged a container from Palermo, citing a discrepancy in the weight logs. It was a container Nora had specifically routed through a blind shell company to avoid this exact scenario. She was currently freezing to death to figure out how a bribe had failed. "The seal is intact," grunted Russo, the dock foreman, shining a heavy maglite on the metal doors of the container in question. He was a massive man who chewed cheap cigars and hated taking orders from a woman 30 years his junior. Inspector came down, tapped the sides, looked at the paperwork, and put a hold on it. "He didn't open it?" Nora asked, swiping through the digital manifest on her tablet. "No, said he needed a supervisor to break the seal. They're coming back at midnight." Nora checked her watch. It was 10:15 p.m. They had less than 2 hours. "The weight log says it's carrying industrial automotive parts," Nora said, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She tapped the screen. 22 tons, but the axle scale at the gate logged it at 28 tons. "That's a 6-ton discrepancy, Russo. Who loaded this?" Russo shifted uncomfortably. "The Palermo crew." "The Palermo crew are idiots who can't do basic math," Nora snapped, her patience entirely gone. 6 tons of unaccounted weight meant 6 tons of contraband, weapons, narcotics, cash. It didn't matter. It was 6 tons of federal prison time sitting under an orange light. "We need an empty container. Identical serial format. We transfer the legitimate cargo into the new box, update the RFID tags in the system to match, and haul this one out of the terminal before midnight. Transfer 22 tons of steel in an hour and a half." Russo spat a piece of tobacco onto the concrete. "Lady, you're out of your mind. I don't have the manpower." "Find the manpower," a voice said from the shadows. Nora didn't flinch, but her pulse spiked. Vincent stepped into the halo of the orange light. He wore a heavy black overcoat over a dark suit, the collar turned up against the wind. He was flanked by 4 men, but they hung back, leaving him to approach Nora and Russo alone. He moved with that same quiet, terrifying grace. The cold air seemed to sharpen his features, turning his jawline into something cut from granite. Russo instantly straightened, pulling the dead cigar from his mouth. "Mr. Rossi, I didn't know you were coming down." "I go where the problems are," Vincent said quietly. His eyes bypassed the foreman completely and locked on to Nora. He took in her wind-whipped hair, the red flush of the cold on her cheeks, and the absolute, furious focus in her eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "We have a 6-ton weight variance," Nora reported, her voice clinical, ignoring the sudden heat flooding her chest. "Customs flagged it. They're coming back at midnight. I told Russo to swap the container and alter the RFID tags." "It's impossible, Mr. Rossi," Russo protested, stepping forward. "The cranes are locked down. We'd have to use the forklifts. We can't move that much weight in the dark without making noise. It's too risky." Vincent didn't look at Russo. He kept his eyes on Nora. "Can the digital trail be scrubbed?" "Already done," Nora said, holding up her tablet. "I backdated a manifest for a secondary container. If they find it gone, the system will show it was cleared by the day shift inspector at 4 p.m. The new container will be waiting in its place." Vincent finally looked at the foreman. The slight amusement in his face vanished, replaced by an absolute, crushing authority. "You have 85 minutes, Russo," Vincent said, his voice flat. "If this container is still sitting here when customs arrives, I am going to lock you inside it and drop it into the lake. Am I understood?" Russo swallowed hard. "Yes, boss. I'll get the crews." He turned and sprinted toward the warehouse, shouting orders into a handheld radio. The heavy hitters fanned out, securing the perimeter of the terminal. Nora and Vincent were left alone in the shadow of the towering steel boxes. The wind howled off the water, rattling a loose chain against a crane. Nora shoved her freezing hands into the pockets of her coat. She refused to shiver. "You shouldn't be down here," Vincent said. He stepped closer, stepping into her space, shielding her from the brunt of the wind with his body. "It's my job to fix logistical failures," Nora replied, tilting her head back to look at him. "Palermo got greedy. They overpacked the shipment." "I'll handle Palermo." "You need to handle your routing managers," she corrected sharply. "They're getting sloppy. They think because they've gotten away with it for a year, the feds have stopped looking. They haven't." Vincent looked down at her. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her cheek. Without asking, without hesitating, he reached out with a gloved hand and brushed it away, tucking it behind her ear. Nora froze. The leather of his glove was cold, but the intent behind the gesture was burning hot. "You are relentless," Vincent murmured, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "I'm pragmatic." "You're freezing." Before she could protest, Vincent unbuttoned his heavy black overcoat, shrugged it off his broad shoulders, and draped it over her. The coat was massive on her, falling to her knees. It was incredibly heavy, lined with silk, and radiated his body heat. The smell of his sharp cologne and ozone instantly enveloped her, a sensory assault that made her breath hitch. "I don't need your coat," Nora said, though she instinctively pulled the lapels tighter around her neck. "Keep it on," he ordered softly. He stood before her in just his suit jacket, seemingly impervious to the biting cold. "I told you I buy the flowers now. This is part of the deal." "There was no deal," Nora argued, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "You made a unilateral declaration." "I run a syndicate, Nora. I don't believe in democracies." He stepped half a foot closer. They were entirely concealed in the narrow alley between two stacked shipping containers. The orange glow of the lights didn't reach them here. It was just shadows, cold air, and the intoxicating heat of his coat wrapped around her. "Did Arthur Davies call you?" Vincent asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was an interrogation. "He left a voicemail," Nora admitted, watching his jaw instantly clench. He was very confused as to why his Chicago routes were suddenly suspended, pending a comprehensive safety review. "He should be grateful I only suspended his routes." "You're petty," Nora accused. "I'm territorial," Vincent corrected. He reached out, gripping both lapels of the heavy coat he had just placed on her. He used the fabric to pull her forward, forcing her to step into him. her chest collided with his solid torso. Nora gasped softly, her hands coming up to press flat against his chest. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart through his suit jacket. "I told you I was entirely irrational when it comes to you," Vincent whispered, leaning down until his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "I spent 3 days locked in my office, trying to convince myself to leave you alone, to let you keep your spreadsheets and your distance." "And," Nora breathed, her eyes closing against her will. "And," Vincent said, his lips grazing her jawline, "I failed." A loud, grinding crash echoed across the terminal as a forklift slammed its tines into a steel container. Nora jerked back, reality crashing down on her like a bucket of ice water. She was standing in a freezing shipping terminal, wearing a Mafia boss's coat, surrounded by smuggled contraband and federal crimes. Vincent let her pull back, though his hands lingered on the coat for a second longer than necessary. His dark eyes locked onto hers, reading the panic and the sharp return of her cynical armor. "Midnight, Nora," he said, stepping out of the shadows and back into the orange light. "Make sure the problem is fixed." He turned and walked away into the freezing dark. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, fluorescent predictability that Nora usually craved. She walked off the private elevator onto the 42nd floor at exactly 7:30 a.m. The bullpen was mostly empty, save for a few early morning analysts drinking black coffee and staring blankly at glowing monitors. Nora walked toward her office. The glass was clear. The floor had been heavily polished, erasing any lingering water stains or microscopic shards of crystal. It looked exactly as it had a week ago, except for the object sitting dead center on her mahogany desk. Nora stopped in the doorway. She dropped her briefcase onto a chair and walked slowly toward the desk. It wasn't a bouquet. It wasn't a sprawling, obnoxious arrangement of fragile white petals meant to impress and dominate. It was a heavy, square planter made of raw, dark concrete. Inside the planter, rooted in dark, rich soil, was a single, thriving plant. It had dark green, leathery leaves and stark, deep crimson flowers that drooped downward like heavy bells. Nora didn't know much about botany, but she knew what a hellebore was. It was a winter rose. It was a plant that refused to die in the frost, that thrived in harsh, freezing conditions, blooming when everything else was dead. It was tough, stubborn, and entirely beautiful in a severe, unapologetic way. Next to the concrete planter lay a small black velvet box and a folded piece of heavy stock paper. Nora picked up the paper first. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, and brutal. Arthur Davies's shipping fleet was seized by British Customs at 4 a.m. this morning. Anonymous tip regarding undeclared cargo. He is currently in custody. He will not be calling again. Look inside the box. V. Nora stared at the note. Vincent hadn't just sunk a competitor. He had orchestrated a surgical strike across an ocean simply to permanently remove an annoyance from her caller ID. It was a terrifying display of power. It was utterly sociopathic. She loved it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her cynical, practical brain had finally surrendered to the undeniable truth. She belonged in this dark, complicated world. She didn't just survive the chaos, she thrived in it. And she craved the monster who controlled it. Nora set the note down. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the black velvet box. She expected a necklace, a bracelet, a diamond to mark her as his property, a brilliant, expensive warning to any other man who dared look her way. She popped the hinge. Inside the box lay a heavy antique iron key. Nora frowned, picking it up. It was old, heavy, and entirely functional. As she lifted it, she saw a second note folded tightly beneath the velvet cushion. She pulled it out and read it. The key to the deadbolt on the inside of my office door. Use it when you are ready to stop pretending. Nora stopped breathing. He wasn't dragging her into his cave. He wasn't forcing the final boundary. He had destroyed the competition, claimed his territory, and placed a stark, unyielding winter plant on her desk to prove he saw exactly who she was. But the final step, the actual crossing of the line, he was handing to her. He was giving her the control. It was the most dangerous, intoxicating move he could have possibly made. "Do you like them?" Nora whipped around. Vincent was standing in the doorway of her office. He wore a navy suit today, immaculately tailored, a stark white shirt, and no tie. He looked rested. He looked like a man who had just won a war without firing a single shot. He didn't step inside. He stood on the threshold, respecting the boundary of the glass wall, waiting. "You had Arthur Davies arrested," Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the early arriving analysts wouldn't hear. "I merely provided British authorities with accurate information," Vincent replied smoothly, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. "It's a civic duty." "You're a menace. I am a man who protects his investments." His dark eyes flicked to the concrete planter. "The hellebore requires very little water. It survives in the dark. It doesn't need to be coddled." He brought his gaze back up to her face. "I thought it was fitting." Nora looked down at the heavy iron key in her palm. The cold metal bit into her skin. She was a logistics director. She analyzed risk. She calculated probability. The probability of this ending well was absolutely zero. If she walked down that hallway and locked his door, there was no going back to just being the woman who fixed spreadsheets. She would be his. In a world where men settled disputes with bullets and bodies were dropped into freezing lakes, being Vincent Rossi's weakness was a death sentence. She closed her fist tightly around the key. She looked up at Vincent. He was perfectly still, watching her process the variables. He wasn't rushing her. He knew exactly what he was asking. "I have quarterly projections due at noon," Nora said, her voice steady, perfectly professional. Vincent's jaw tightened a fraction of an inch, the only sign that her deflection had hit him. He nodded slowly, masking his disappointment behind a wall of cold indifference. "Of course. Send them to my secure server when they are finished." He turned away from her door and began to walk down the hall toward his corner suite. Nora stood at her desk. She watched his broad shoulders retreat. She listened to the sharp, rhythmic click of his expensive leather shoes on the hardwood floor. She let out a long, ragged exhale. To hell with the spreadsheets. Nora bypassed her chair. She walked out of her office, the heavy iron key gripped so tightly in her right hand, her knuckles ached. She didn't run, but her pace was sharp, purposeful. The few analysts in the bullpen looked up, sensing the shift in the air, but quickly dropped their eyes back to their monitors. Vincent had reached his office. He had just opened the heavy oak door when he heard her footsteps. He stopped, turning his head. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't stop a respectful distance away. She walked straight up to him, pushed past his shoulder, and stepped directly into the sprawling, sunlit expanse of his corner office. Vincent stood perfectly still in the doorway, his eyes dark, burning holes into her. Nora turned to face him. She held up her right hand and opened her fingers. The antique iron key rested on her palm. "Shut the door, Vincent," she ordered. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across his face. A feral, unrestrained look of absolute victory. Vincent stepped inside. He grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut behind him. The final sound in the room was the heavy, definitive thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. The silence in Vincent's office was absolute, insulated by thick glass and reinforced walls. Vincent did not rush her. He stood near the center of the room, the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows casting long, sharp shadows across the Persian rug. He watched her hand drop from the deadbolt. He watched her chest rise and fall. He was giving her 3 seconds to panic, to apologize, to unlock the door and run back to her spreadsheets. Nora didn't move. She held his gaze, her chin tilted up, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the bridge she had just burned. Vincent exhaled. It was a ragged, deeply human sound. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't grab her waist this time. He took her face in both of his hands. His palms were warm, the calluses scraping slightly against her cheekbones. He tilted her head up and crashed his mouth down on hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a collision. It was 3 years of repressed, suffocating proximity finally snapping. Nora gasped into his mouth, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his navy suit. She anchored herself against him as he backed her up. Her shoulders hit the heavy oak door. The impact knocked the breath out of her, but Vincent didn't give her time to recover. He kissed her with a starved, punishing intensity, his tongue sweeping past her teeth, tasting of dark roast coffee and copper. Nora kissed him back just as hard. Her cynical, logical brain finally shut down, overridden by the sheer, crushing physical reality of him. She slid her hands up to his neck, her fingers twisting into the dark hair at his nape. Vincent groaned, a low, guttural vibration in the back of his throat. He tore his mouth from hers, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He inhaled sharply, breathing her in as if she were oxygen. "You're a terrifying woman," he muttered against her skin, his breath hot, raising a violent shiver down her spine. "You gave me the key," Nora managed to say, her voice breathless, unrecognizable even to herself. "I gave you a choice." Vincent pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the dark brown irises. "I needed you to make it, because from this second forward, there are no more choices, Nora. You don't get to change your mind tomorrow. You don't get to transfer to a different department. You don't get to leave." It was a warning. It was a possessive, terrifying mandate. "I know how contracts work, Vincent," she said steadily. A sharp, dangerous smile flashed across his face. He kissed her again, slower this time. A deep, deliberate claiming that made her knees feel weak. Then he stepped back, taking one of her hands and pulling her toward the center of the room. His office was a reflection of the man, stark, expensive, and entirely functional. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, completely clear of clutter. There were no photographs, no personal effects, just a multi-monitor setup, a secure landline, and a crystal decanter of scotch on a side table. Vincent walked her around the desk and pressed a hidden button under the lip of the wood. A seamless panel in the oak paneling behind the desk popped open with a quiet hiss of hydraulics. Behind it sat a heavy, matte black steel safe. Vincent punched a 12-digit code into the keypad. The heavy door clicked open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. It looked archaic compared to the digital operation Nora ran. He dropped it onto the desk in front of her. "What is this?" Nora asked, staring at the worn leather. "The ghost roots," Vincent said, quietly. He poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass and handed it to her. "You run my legitimate logistics. You hide my shipments in plain sight using shell companies and manipulated weight logs. You are brilliant at it." He poured a second glass for himself and leaned back against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. "But that is only 40% of the Rossi Syndicate's gross income," he continued. "The other 60% isn't logged on a server. It can't be found by a federal hacker. It exists entirely on paper, written in a cipher that only 2 men in this organization understand." Nora took a slow sip of the scotch. It burned a clean, hot path down her throat. "You and Russo?" "Me and my father," Vincent corrected, his voice hardening slightly. "Before he died." Nora looked down at the ledger. She understood the weight of what he was doing. In the Mafia, information was currency, but it was also a weapon. By placing this book in front of her, Vincent was handing her the gun and pointing it directly at his own chest. If she took this ledger to the FBI, she would dismantle a 50-year-old criminal empire in an afternoon. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because I don't sleep with my employees," Vincent said, flatly. He set his glass down. "I don't keep secrets from the people in my bed. If you are going to stand next to me, Nora, you need to know exactly what kind of hell you are standing in." He reached out and flipped the cover open. The pages were filled with neat, handwritten columns of numbers, dates, and locations. There were names Nora didn't recognize. Offshore accounts, payoffs to city officials, federal judges, and union bosses. It was a roadmap of systemic, institutional corruption. "I want you to manage it," Vincent said, watching her face carefully. "I want you to digitize it onto a closed, encrypted server that only you and I have access to. I trust your brain, Nora, and I trust you." Nora stared at the numbers. It was dangerous. It was highly illegal. It carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years in federal prison, if caught. She felt her pulse steady. "The cipher is flawed," she said, tapping a column on the second page. "You're using a repeating sequence based on a Julian calendar. A decent cryptographer at the Bureau could crack this in a week if they got their hands on it." Vincent stared at her for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a rich, genuine sound that echoed in the large office. He reached out, gripping the back of her neck, and pulled her in for a hard kiss on the forehead. "You," he murmured against her skin, "are going to be the death of me." "I am going to keep you out of federal custody," Nora corrected, pulling the ledger closer. "Now give me a pen." 4 months later, the transition from logistics director to the second most powerful person in the Rossi Syndicate happened quietly. There was no announcement. There was no change in her official title. But the bullpen knew. They saw the way Vincent looked at her. They saw the way her security clearance was suddenly limitless. More importantly, they saw that when Vincent was out of the building, Nora's word carried the exact same lethal weight as his. It was a Tuesday in late November. The sky outside the 42nd floor was the color of bruised iron, spitting sleet against the reinforced glass. Nora was in her office, staring at the encrypted offline terminal Vincent had installed beneath her desk. She was finalizing the transfer of $3 million through a labyrinth of Cayman Island accounts to pay a Colombian supplier. At 2:14 p.m., the silent alarm triggered. It wasn't a siren. It was a subtle, flashing red border on her main computer monitor. It meant one thing. The lobby security had been breached by law enforcement. Nora didn't panic. Panic was a useless emotion that slowed down reaction time. She slammed her hand down on the heavy red button mounted under her desk. In the bullpen, the phones instantly died. The network connection severed. The heavy electromagnetic locks on the main glass doors of the 42nd floor engaged with a loud metallic clack. Vincent was out of the building. He was at the docks, dealing with a union dispute. She was alone. Nora stood up and walked out of her office. The bullpen was entirely silent. 20 men, all hardened criminals dressed in corporate suits, stood frozen by their desks, looking at her. "Federal agents are in the elevators," Nora said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "We have 90 seconds. Do not draw your weapons. Do not speak. If they ask you a question, you request legal counsel." She pointed to 3 men near the server room. "Wipe the whiteboards. Shred the hard copies on the corner desks. Go." The men scrambled, the absolute authority in her voice cutting through their adrenaline. Nora walked swiftly to the main server room at the back of the floor. It was a glass-enclosed, climate-controlled box, humming with racks of blinking lights. She scanned her biometric badge, pushed the door open, and stepped into the freezing air. She walked to the master console. She typed in a 40-character alphanumeric sequence. A prompt appeared on the screen. "Initiate Protocol Omega YN." Protocol Omega was the nuclear option. It wouldn't just delete files. It would send a massive electrical surge through the hard drives, physically melting the platters and permanently destroying the legitimate shipping logs, along with all the cleverly hidden ghost manifests. It would cost the company millions. It would plunge the logistics operation into total darkness. But it would keep Vincent out of a cage. Nora could hear the heavy muffled shouts coming from the lobby through the thick glass walls. The elevators had arrived. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of a heavy battering ram hitting the reinforced glass doors of the 42nd floor echoed through the bullpen. Nora hit Y. The server racks immediately began to whine. The pitch escalated to a deafening, high-frequency scream. Smoke began to curl from the top vents of the closest rack as the electrical surge hit the hardware. The smell of ozone and melting plastic filled the small room. Nora stepped out of the server room and locked the door behind her just as the main doors to the bullpen shattered. Glass exploded inward. Dozens of men in dark windbreakers poured into the room, assault rifles raised. "FBI, nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" The noise was deafening. The chaos was absolute. Nora stood calmly by the server room door, her hands resting lightly in the pockets of her tailored trousers. She watched the agent swarm the room, pressing Rossi's men against the desks, zip-tying their wrists. A tall man with graying hair and a sharp, exhausted face walked through the shattered doors. He wore a badge clipped to his belt. He ignored the men on the floor and walked straight toward Nora. "Nora Hayes," he said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded resigned. "I'm Agent Cole. We have a federal warrant to seize all servers, hard drives, and physical ledgers on this floor. "Good afternoon, Agent Cole," Nora said smoothly. "My legal counsel is on speed dial, but you are welcome to execute your warrant." She stepped aside, gesturing toward the server room. Agent Cole looked through the glass. The smoke was thick now, obscuring the blinking lights. The servers were dead. His jaw clenched. He looked back at Nora, his eyes narrowing. "That's destruction of evidence. That's a federal charge." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Nora lied seamlessly, her face a mask of polite confusion. "The servers have been experiencing overheating issues all week. I put in a maintenance request yesterday. It seems they finally shorted out. It's a terrible loss for our logistics team." Cole stepped closer to her. "Vincent Rossi is going down, Miss Hayes. He's a thug in a nice suit. You're a smart woman with a clean record. Why are you throwing your life away for a man who would trade you for a lighter sentence in a heartbeat?" Nora looked at the federal agent. She thought about the heavy iron key sitting in her purse. She thought about the ledger safely encrypted on an offline drive hidden in a false wall in Vincent's penthouse. "You underestimate my employer, Agent Cole," Nora said softly, "and you vastly underestimate me." "Search the offices," Cole barked to his men, turning away from her in disgust. "Tear the walls down if you have to." They tore the place apart for 6 hours. They found nothing. No ledgers, no weapons, no contraband. Just a ruined server room and 20 silent men who refused to answer a single question without a lawyer present. By 8 p.m., the feds were forced to leave the building, empty-handed, carrying boxes of useless melted hard drives. Nora stood alone in the center of the ruined bullpen. The glass was everywhere. The desks were overturned. It looked like a war zone. The private elevator in the corner pinged. The doors slid open, and Vincent walked out. He didn't look at the damage. He didn't look at the shattered main doors. He looked only at Nora. He crossed the room, stepping over overturned chairs and broken glass, the crunching sound echoing in the empty space. When he reached her, he didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask what the feds took. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight, his eyes searching her face for any sign of injury or panic. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a harsh rasp. "No," Nora said. Vincent let out a long, shuddering breath and pulled her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in her hair. She could feel the violent, adrenaline-fueled tremor in his arms. "They have nothing, Vincent," Nora whispered against his chest, wrapping her arms around his waist. "The servers are slag. The offline ledger is secure at the penthouse. They just wasted 6 months of taxpayer money." Vincent pulled back, framing her face in his hands. He looked at her with a mixture of awe, possession, and absolute reverence. "I leave you alone for 4 hours, he murmured, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "And you burn my company to the ground." "I saved your company," Nora corrected. "Now take me out of here. It smells like melting plastic." They didn't go to his penthouse. It was too predictable. The feds would be waiting, hoping for a fractured, exhausted mistake. Instead, Vincent drove them 2 hours north, deep into the Wisconsin woods. The safe house was a sprawling structure of dark timber and stone, practically invisible against the frozen lake. It was dead quiet, off the grid. By 1 a.m., the adrenaline crash finally hit Nora. Her limbs felt heavy, her skull throbbing in time with her pulse. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the jagged moonlight reflecting off the ice. The reality of her actions settled into her marrow. She had permanently crossed the line. She was a syndicate conspirator with a federal target on her back. Behind her, a match struck. The smell of sulfur and dry pine filled the freezing room as Vincent lit the massive stone hearth. A moment later, his heavy overcoat dropped over her shoulders. He stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. "Are you regretting it?" His voice lacked its usual arrogant edge. In the dark, stripped of his city armor, he sounded entirely human, exhausted, vulnerable. "Melting $1 million worth of hardware?" Nora asked, keeping her eyes on the frozen lake. "Tying yourself to a man the FBI just tried to put in a cage. You had a pristine record, Nora. Cole would have given you full immunity today." Nora turned in his arms. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the harsh angles of his jaw. He was waiting for the panic. He was waiting for her to run. She reached up, her palm resting flat against his rough cheek. "3 years ago, you asked me if I was afraid of the dark," Nora said softly, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. "The dark is just an absence of light. It's predictable. Normal men bore me, Vincent. I like the danger. I like you." The feral, coiled tension drained out of his shoulders. Vincent didn't say another word. He just leaned down and kissed her. A slow, deep, desperate claiming. He picked her up, carrying her into the shadows of the bedroom as the overcoat slipped to the floor. The next morning, Nora woke to an empty bed. She pulled on a thick wool sweater and walked out to the living room. The fire was still burning. Vincent sat at the heavy oak dining table with a mug of black coffee and an encrypted tablet. Nora stopped halfway across the room. Sitting directly beside his tablet was the heavy concrete planter. The dark green leaves of the hellebore were untouched. The deep crimson flowers still drooped, defiant and alive. While the feds tore the office apart, he had made sure someone saved it. Nora walked to the table, her cynical smile reaching her eyes. She pulled the tablet directly from his hands. "The Rotterdam dock is flagged," she said, tapping the screen. "We need 3 new shell companies by Friday." Vincent leaned back, watching her work. "Whatever you need." Nora didn't look up. She knew exactly what she had, and she knew exactly who she belonged to. They were locked in a room of their own making, and she was never giving back the key. Thank you for watching this story. If Nora and Vincent's intense, high-stakes romance kept you captivated until the very end, please hit that like button to show your support. What was your favorite moment from their dark and dangerous journey? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with fellow Mafia drama lovers, and absolutely subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you never miss our next thrilling audio story. Your support keeps these stories coming. See you in the next video.